Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. Every once in a while, when we have our new book review, I get to pick a book by an author I really like. So I've read several of Frans DeWaal's books. So he's a wonderful writer. He really makes science accessible, and he's, I guess you could say he's kind of funny too sometimes, talking about human beings. But anyway, Sherrie Lyons is, she's written 2 well-received books. I can say that because I had to read a lot of book reviews for my living. And one is a biography of Thomas Henry Huxley, The Evolution of a Scientist. The other book is called, and Sherrie's going to be here this fall talking about her book at our noontime, so look for that. It's called Species, Serpents, Spirits, and Skulls, Science at the Margins of the Victorian Age. It's a book that, again, got really very good reviews, and she has a PhD in the history of science. Is that what? Yeah. Okay. And she teaches at, now I forgot. Was it
Empire?
Empire. Okay, I'm thinking of the other one. So here's Sherrie Lyons to tell us about the book. It's by Frans DeWaal, the famous primatologist. It's called The Age of Empathy: Nature's Lessons for a Kinder Society.
Thanks.
All right, can you?
Yes. So, oops, little.
You can put that right underneath there.
Yes, little show and tell. So this is the book that I'm going to be talking about. I'm really pleased to be able to present this review because I've been actually quite a fan of DeWaal. I've been following his work for many years. I've met him several times over the years. And last spring, I was fortunate to be attending a conference called Darwin's Reach, where he was a keynote speaker. And his lecture was on empathy and the perceptions of emotions, richly illustrated with many short videos of chimps and monkeys. The lecture, I think, was really a preview of this book, which was published just a couple of months later. So again, for those of you who might not be familiar with him, he's a leading Dutch researcher on primatology in primate behavior. His early work was done in Holland, but for many years he has done research and is now director of the Living Links Center at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center at Emory University in Atlanta. So over the years, he has published many popular books that summarize his and related research, beginning with Chimpanzee Politics in 1982's. Other titles include Peacemaking of the Primates, The Ape and the Sushi Master. My personal favorite, I think, even still is this book, which is already from 1996, which Good-Natured, The Origins of Right and Wrong. So this book, this latest one, like his other ones, is very readable. It's very entertaining. He interweaves stories from headlines like the collapse of Enron and a lot of observations of human behavior, particularly children, but with a particular emphasis, of course, on animal stories. But the book is not just a collection of animal anecdotes, although I will have more to say about that in a moment. All these books are sliding off here. But rather, his books are summarizing years and years of carefully designed experiments that required thousands of hours of painstakingly detailed and careful observations of behaviors of chimps and other monkeys, along with field research. The book is also valuable because it also cites research on other animals as well. And so I think DeWaal actually builds on a long tradition of using animal stories to develop scientific ideas. And in fact, I just want to mention that animal stories I really consider, in fact, a kind of crucial piece of evidence that Darwin used to build his case for a moral sense, the evolution of a moral sense. So DeWaal mentions in the preface of this book, with the meltdown of Wall Street, this seemed to be proof of greed and selfishness rules in terms of human behavior. I can't tell you when I was at that Darwin Reach conference how many references were made to Bernie Madoff and that. It was really pretty interesting. But DeWaal says now he's optimistic with the election of Obama, and even because of this meltdown and that, Obama has talked about an empathy deficit in various speeches. DeWaal thinks that maybe the tide has turned. And he's hopeful that American politics might really be ready to advance a doctrine that emphasizes social responsibility and cooperation. Hence the title, This Will Be the Age of Empathy. The theme of the book is that there's a long evolutionary history of selection for such traits, and that's the subtitle of his book, Nature's Lessons for a Kinder Society. We can get help from nature rather than having to go against nature. Now, I'm sure many of you think that evolution teaches nature red in tooth and claw. Survival of the fittest is the catchphrase that's often used to describe natural selection. But in fact, this phrase comes from Herbert Spencer, not Darwin. So the social policies that are associated with this view should really be called social Spencerianism rather than social Darwinism. And there certainly is a long tradition of evolutionary biologists who emphasize this aspect of nature. But if you actually read Darwin, particularly Descent of Man, my well-thumbed copy here that is totally falling apart, cooperation is equally an important theme to this work. And it is something that is not unique to humans. We find it in many species, from the social insects to wolves cooperating for the hunt. DeWaal has long argued that since moral systems are universal of human societies, the tendency to develop them must be an integral part of human nature. And in this book, as he says, ideologies come and go, but human nature is here to stay. Of course, the question is, what is human nature? But he does say if we're biological beings and we accept an evolutionary account of our origin, then we must take morality quite seriously, and we must build it into our theories about human behavior. And this is, in fact, exactly what Darwin did in Descent of Man. But of course, Darwin's main concern was how a moral sense could have evolved, rather than defining what is moral. But DeWaal's interest is a little different. He asks, in fact, do animals exhibit behavior that is parallel to human benevolence, as well as rules and regulations of human moral conduct? If so, what motivates them and to act this way? Do they understand that their behavior affects others? Well, DeWaal answers this question with an unequivocal yes. And his whole career has basically been devoted to providing evidence for that view. We can see the origins of right and wrong in primate behavior. And studying primate behavior not only demonstrates the evolution of ethics, but it also shows that the ethics of evolution is not contrary to our own ethical sensibilities. And this latest book goes even further by trying to make a case for empathy. So the early chapters summarize some of his earlier research, but also supplement it with the more recent findings. DeWaal was typical of most people who were studying primate behavior at the time when he first started his research. He was studying aggression in primates, and there certainly was no shortage of it. But he became interested in conflict resolution after the death of his favorite chimp, as he watched the Machiavellian politics, which he, in the Arnhem Zoo, that he actually described in Chimpanzee Politics. Now, there, of course, often is aggression in the wild as chimps engage in warfare over territory, but they also occasionally kill their own, even within the community. And he also knew that chimps often kiss and embrace after they fight, but he had never paid much attention to it. But when he stood by the vet who was operating on his favorite chimp after a horrible attack, 2 chimps had ganged up on him, bit him, cut him, castrated him, and the chimp did eventually die. So after that, DeWaal decided that he realized how important this sort of peacekeeping behavior and conflict resolution was important to chimp society, and it basically changed the whole focus of his career. So in a section called Enron and the Selfish Gene, he takes on Richard Dawkins, who you know is the author of this book called The Selfish Gene, who he admits that he's often disagreed with over the years. Well, Enron's CEO, Jeff Skilling, who is now in prison, was a great fan of Dawkins. He set up a peer review committee known as Rank and Yank. And the thinking behind it was that humans were only motivated by two fundamental drives, fear and greed. This, of course, turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy at Enron. As people eventually did anything within that community, they created an atmosphere that resulted in widespread dishonesty within and mass exploitation outside of the company until finally Enron imploded in 2001. DeWaal goes on and says, well, the book of nature is like the Bible. Everybody reads into it what they want, from tolerance to intolerance. Genes cannot be any more selfish than a river can be angry. Now Dawkins had also backtracked, and he said when he coined the term selfish gene, he meant it only metaphorically. I personally do not think that was true, and we can talk about that later if you want. But I was pleased to learn from DeWaal's book that in the 30th anniversary edition of The Selfish Gene, Dawkins retracted this statement, quote, "Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish." Nevertheless, Skilling, like many others, did not just take the term metaphorically, but rather, if genes are selfish, so must we be. And so we have to work consciously against our basic selfish nature. Well, is in fact being selfish a good strategy? As DeWaal wrote in the dog world that Skilling created, which I'm surprised he used that term because it's kind of an insult to the dogs, and DeWaal knows that. But Enron did, in fact, eventually collapse under its own selfish weight. DeWaal rates humans as some of the most highly aggressive of all primates, but at the same time, we are not obligatory aggressive. Just like chimps, we can be described as highly competitive animals, and it's a constant struggle to keep these selfish, aggressive urges in check. Or we could be instead described as highly competitive animals that also have an amazing ability to get along and engage in the give and take that is necessary to live in societies. The larger message is that if biology is to inform science and society, and the government, rather, we need to get a full picture and not this simplistic view of social Darwinism, but to look at what evolution really says. This whole area of evolutionary ethics in general has a very terrible reputation, and for a very good reason. So I also want to just briefly mention a little more of the backstory of why I wanted to review this book. I have been interested in DeWaal's work because I myself work in evolutionary theory, and I got drawn into evolutionary ethics because of my research on Thomas Huxley. And so Huxley, in one of his most famous works, Evolution and Ethics, little plug here, this is a reprint which I wrote the introduction for. It's based on his Romani's lectures in 1893, and he laid out why he did not think evolution that we could look to nature for guidelines about ethics. As he said, evolution might show us how the moral sentiments come about, but I'm quoting Huxley here, he says, but as the immoral sentiments have no less been evolved, there is as far as much natural sanction for one as the other. The thief and the murderer follow nature just as much as the philanthropist. And then he goes on and he says, let us understand once and for all that the ethical process of society depends not on imitating the cosmic process, still less in running away from it, but in combating it. Okay? So, of course, this does seem to be a pretty devastating critique of evolutionary ethics. But as I mentioned in my introduction, I think these views have to be situated in the historical context. In fact, earlier in the 1860s, right after Darwin published The Origin of Species, Huxley had been quite sympathetic to applying the insights of nature to the human realm. And he said if people directed their affections and wills into an earnest and loving desire to move in harmony with nature's laws, this would lead to a fair and just society. But by the time of the Romani's lectures, things had really changed. The survival of the fittest mentality of Spencer had was very widespread, very popular. Spencer was against any kind of poor laws or safety net to help the less fortunate members of society, saying that this would only, contribute to the survival of the unfit, okay? And so Huxley couldn't abide by that, and the Romani's lectures were, in fact, a response to that. Now, this survival of the fittest goes in and out of vogue. Peter Kropotkin, who also DeWaal mentions in his most recent book, claimed that natural selection promoted group characteristics and sentiments, and that we have a natural sentiment to help each other. So Kropotkin says the fittest are the most sociable animals, and sociability appears to be the chief factor of evolution. Those mammals which stand at the very top of the animal world and most approach man by their structure and intelligence are the most sociable. So Kropotkin's ideas, of course, are diametrically opposed to Spencer. But both of these men are claiming that they got their ideas directly out of evolutionary theory. I think it's more accurate to say that they read their own social political views into evolutionary theory. But this is, of course, the problem with, and continues to be the problem with evolutionary ethics. And I think this is evidenced by, in fact, the contentious literature of sociobiology and now evolutionary psychology. So where I come into this is that DeWaal, in the past, has used Huxley as kind of a straw man in order to promote his more sort of kind view of human nature. And I have talked to him over the years at various meetings I've seen him, and he pretty much ignored me. And this scapegoating really came to a head with the book most recently, before this book, which was called Primates and Philosophers, How Morality Evolved. And it was based on the very prestigious Tanner lectures he gave. And he was particularly scathing about Huxley, who he claimed that was largely responsible for the idea that we could not look to nature for helping us develop ideas about our ethics. So, of course, this was very stressful to me because, as you can tell, I'm actually a big fan of DeWaal's work. And I've been very influenced by him in my own work, but I did my PhD on Thomas Huxley, and I feel like DeWaal was not a Huxley scholar, right? I mean, he's not a science historian. So I was coming to this Darwin conference, in fact, to talk about and I knew DeWaal was coming there, and so I got up my courage, wrote him a letter, sent him the introduction to this reprint, and we emailed back and forth, and I was like, oh, I think I might have convinced him. And then I was very thrilled in his fabulous keynote talk that he actually did lay the blame on Spencer. He didn't mention Huxley. I'm very happy he doesn't mention Huxley in this book, although actually I think he could use Huxley, in fact, to recruit to his point of view, but that's fine. Anyway, the point is, he did emphasize Dawkins, he emphasized Spencer, and he quotes another biologist, Matt Ridley, who said, our minds might have been built by selfish genes, but they've been built to be socially trustworthy and cooperative. Okay, so now what I want to do for the rest of the talk is actually highlight some of the research that he talks about. I am going to mainly talk about animals, although, as I said, this book, I think even more than any of his others, he really keeps trying to tie it in with humans. But the reason I'm emphasizing the animal stories is because I think this is what is the principal point of the book. Nature's lessons for a kinder society. Kindness and morality are not unique to humans. So in Chapter 3, Bodies to Bodies, DeWaal begins to build the case for empathy not just in us, but in other animals. First, he points out from an evolutionary point of view It doesn't matter what animals learn from us, but rather how they act with each other. One of the take-home messages from this chapter is that both animal and human cognition depends very heavily on the body-brain interaction, and that the body is informing the brain. The brain is not just a computer sort of ordering the body around, but rather the body-brain relationship is a two-way street. Apes need to see each other, actually to ape one another. In fact, this term aping is now actually really taking on a whole new meaning with the latest research in neurobiology. And we're finding that mimicry is crucial to both human and animal learning. So how has he demonstrated this? Well, the chimps are given a puzzle box that they can get access to in two ways. They can poke a stick into it and the food rolls out, or they can use a stick to lift a lever that releases the food, and both methods work. So they teach the poking methods to a high-ranking female, and then other chimps learn from her. And they too then get their little M&Ms once they've learned how to do this. Now they repeat this experiment with a different group. They take another high-ranking female, but they teach her the lifting method. And once again, the chimps learn from her. So you've got two groups of chimps, pokers and lifters, all right? But if they actually also give a group that they don't teach, the chimps never figure out how to do it, okay? But here's what I mean about the carefulness of his experimental design. So in another experiment that's a variation of the old kind of telephone game, a chimp is shown a box that he can open either by sliding the door or by lifting it up. So they teach one chimp how to slide the door. And then that chimp teaches it to another chimp, who then teaches it to another chimp. Well, after 6 pairings, the last chimp still prefers to slide the door. Then they do the same experiment again with another chimp that they teach the lifting method. And he teaches chimp number 2, chimp number 3, and so on. Same result. That last chimp now wants to lift. But here's what's very clever, is how in fact did the chimp learn how to do this? Did the chimp learn by actually imitating the chimp, watching the chimp's movement? Or did the chimp learn just by watching the box? Yeah, I see the door slides. That's how you do it. Okay, well, to rule out that second hypothesis, they very cleverly designed a box, kind of a magic box, a box that opened and closed by itself, all right, the ghost box. Well, no matter how long the chimps watch this magic box, they never learn. They never learn how to open the box, okay? So it's like they really have to see the chimp physically moving the door to the side to learn how to do it themselves. They're making this body connection with another body. So then DeWaal again goes into a bunch of other evidence he cites in support of this importance of mimicry. Now, what about the importance of mimicry? We actually mimic those who we identify with, and this in turn strengthens our bonds. Newborn humans will stick out their tongues in response to their mom sticking out their tongue. Human mothers play, patty cake games and that. It's all a way of like getting in rhythm and getting in sync. DeWaal mentions dancing as a way of creating a bond, and I am actually an avid social dancer, and I can tell you, in fact, I have a friend who says, when you connect with a partner, it's like having a 3-minute love affair on the dance floor. And for Argentine tango, which is my current passion, we actually have a saying, like when we really get this great connection with a partner in the music, we say, we are in the tango zone. And it's like being in a meditative state that just brings this tremendous sense of well-being. So what are examples of this in-sync phenomena in animals? Well, birds, like one bird sings and others start singing, the howling of monkeys, howling of wolves. These are all examples of these kinds of phenomena that create bonding. Now, the idea of mimicry being crucial to learning and that it is hardwired into us is also finding additional support in another kind of evidence, the discovery of mirror neurons, which he also briefly discusses. In 1995, Rosselati and his co-workers discovered a group of neurons in the brains of monkeys that are activated not only when an action is performed, but also when the observer watches another perform that action. So they're firing not just when you experience pain, but if you were experiencing pain, my mirror neurons would fire, seeing you in pain. Okay? So in essence, these are neurons that are part of a network that allows you to see the world from another point of view. And they were dubbed mirror neurons because they are mirroring the action in the brain of the observer. Ramachandran, who's another very interesting and prominent neurobiologist, called them empathy neurons or Dalai Lama neurons. It's as if the mirror neurons dissolve the barrier between self and other. The fact that they were first discovered in monkeys is another indication that empathy is not unique to humans. It's hardwired in us. We don't decide to be empathetic, we simply are. Thus, for example, when electrodes are hooked up to register the tiniest muscle movement in people, and people are presented with images of happy faces, or they smile involuntarily, and they frown when they see angry faces. And what's really impressive about this is those reactions occur even when those images are flashed so briefly that the person doesn't even have a conscious perception of it, okay? And furthermore, the people who had been exposed to the happy faces claimed that they felt better, even though they had no conscious perception of what they had seen. This is known as emotional contagion, and it is in fact an example of what is true empathy, although in a very primitive form. This response is widespread, it's very ancient, and it probably goes back to when prenatal care was first evolved. And as an aside to all of this, it was very funny preparing this talk. I don't know, has anybody heard about using Botox to treat depression? Well, I heard it where I often get my first breaking news. I heard it on a Jay Leno monologue. And his comment was, well, the person may still be depressed, but at least he's smiling. He can't frown, okay? So I, like you, regarded this as a total joke, but also was wondering what kind of dumb and perhaps dangerous treatment is this? But then, about a week later, on NPR's show, where people were calling in to a psychologist, one person called in and was asking about the legitimacy of the Botox treatment for depression. Well, the psychologist was not familiar with it, but then went on to say, no, he could see this would be a very plausible treatment, and he cited this research on emotional contagion. So Leno was making a joke, but in fact, his joke was exactly how the treatment would work. And there is, in fact, clinical evidence for it. So, I mean, I'm not advocating it, I'm just pointing this out. I mean, because it's mentioned, you know, I mean, as I said, DeWaal presents a lot of evidence about this idea of emotional contagion from including things like commiserating mice who react to other mice being subjected to pain. A female chimp who was deaf and could not hear her baby screaming when she sat down on it by mistake, but other females heard what was happening. They were very visibly upset. The mother chimp saw their reaction, then realized what she had done, all right? Now, there's been a lot of work that has shown gender difference in empathy that begins at a very young age, with females being more empathetic. This does not mean that males can't be empathetic, but again, I think this would make sense evolutionarily, that we might find a gender difference, since females generally do more of the care of the young, and it certainly would be critical to survival, especially to newborns, that mom be finely attuned to her baby's needs. All right. What other lessons can we take from natures? Do animals have a sense of fairness and justice? Do we see it in non-human primates? At the lecture, honestly, I wish I had the tapes to show you. He showed the videos of this experiment that are in this book, and they were really astounding. So here's the experiment. 2 capuchin monkeys are in cages side by side. They can see each other. They each have a pile of pebbles, and they're trained that if they give the researcher a pebble, they get a cucumber as a treat, okay? So you're seeing the pictures, you know, the monkeys are giving the pebbles and they're getting cucumbers. They're very happy. Then one capuchin monkey starts to get a grape instead, which is considered a higher quality treat because it's sweet. Well, after a while, the first monkey, who remember was perfectly happy with the cucumber, is like, he's getting a grape. So first, he just sort of drops the cucumber. Then he starts throwing it. By the end, he totally refuses to participate in the experiment. He's just sitting in the back of the cage, basically sulking, all right? Now, skeptics, in another book, which I actually had brought, but I think it must have fallen out, called Wild Justice, discusses this experiments too, and that says, well, skeptics claim that monkeys are just showing greed and envy. But greed and envy, in fact, are counterparts to justice. If you don't have a sense of being shortchanged and entitled to more, then why would you feel envious, all right? What about trust? In an old-fashioned zoo, and a monkey was kept in the same enclosure in the hippo. After the hippo had eaten his fill, the little monkey would approach the hippo and tap on his mouth. It was as if the monkey was a dental hygienist. The hippo opened his mouth wide, and the monkey would pull out the food remains. The hippo seemed not to mind at all and kept his mouth open as long as the monkey continued his little job. Now, hippos are not carnivores, but still, this was a great act of trust. I don't know about you, but I'm not about ready to stick my head in a hippo's mouth. So, you know, we see this in other animals too. Cleaner, rasher fishes feed on ectoparasites of much larger fish who could easily eat them. So again, I could continue on with the many, many wonderful examples that are in this book, but I hope I've given you a flavor for the kinds of evidence and the structure of the book. So what I want to do in the remaining few minutes is sort of sum up his sort of broader themes of the book and what the significance is of this research, particularly its relevance for the human condition. If empathy was found only in our species, this would mean it was a relatively young trait and had evolved recently. But young traits tend to be experimental and they could fall away. DeWaal, I think, makes a very convincing case that empathy has a very ancient evolutionary pedigree, arising in the mammalian line that began over 100 million years ago. It means that our ancestors not only could feel what others felt, but understood what others might want or need. He uses the analogy of a Russian doll of how full empathy arose. First, there's the development of motor mimicry, state matching with another state, and then the idea of emotional contagion. Then comes concern for others, providing consolation, and then the idea of true empathy. This means being able to take the perspective of others and to provide targeted helping. Ramachandran wrote about the importance of mirror neurons, and when he said what he said at first seemed to me counterintuitive, but I think he's exactly right, and it mirrors, if you like, DeWaal's analogy to the Russian dolls. Ramachandran suggests awareness of others evolved before awareness of self, and that self-awareness may just be a byproduct of the awareness of others. In terms of basic survival, though, this really makes a lot of sense. You need to be able to be aware and react to others in your environment, and you don't have to be self-aware in order to do that. Now, obviously, the idea of empathy is quite sophisticated, and it would have come much later. Obviously, simply other awareness is not empathy. However, empathy would also have great survival value. First in the caring of offspring, but then in just reading the intentionality of others in a group. This, of course, has a downside as well, making possible manipulation and deception. The true psychopath has a very finely honed sense and ability to read others, but then, of course, uses that skill for nefarious purposes. Our big brain has made us capable of the greatest acts of kindness, but also of evil unknown in the rest of the world. A cat is not going to blow up the world or launch a terrorist attack. So DeWaal also does discuss what he calls the dark side of empathy. But as he said, war atrocities are not proof of the absence of empathy. Rather, he says, warfare is psychologically complex, and leaving aside the motives for war, oil, territory, minerals, and so on, the kind of war we wage, he thinks, is more a product of hierarchy and following orders than of aggression and lack of mercy. Think about the indoctrination that must go on that is a part of a military training to make people capable of killing, and the demonization of the enemy that must occur. Soldiers who are suffering from PTSD, part of what is causing their problems is not what they saw, the horrors of what they saw, but also of what they may have done themselves, which causes them great psychic distress. It's not in their nature. Now, the Dalai Lama, in fact, maintains that at our most fundamental level, human beings are compassionate, and that cooperation rather than conflict are at the heart of our basic existence. And the reason I mention the Dalai Lama is because he has been instrumental in forging a collaboration between Buddhist monks and neuroscientists looking at what's called expert meditation to investigate this question. But he does, and so even though he's not a scientist, he bases his belief on certain observations, which I think are quite correct. All sentient beings desire happiness. None desire suffering. All living beings, including animals, appreciate affection, and all creatures prefer resting and quietness compared to bloody encounters. So in the end, in spite of all the terrible suffering we see, and there is no doubt there is constant brutality going on around the world and at home, DeWaal is optimistic because empathy's origins go deep into our evolutionary past. This means that it's a robust trait, that it's a human universal, and we can try and foster and grow it. We have natural tendencies to form social hierarchies. Children, like many animals, spontaneously form them. We can foster those tendencies, such as with the military, or we can counter them as we see in small egalitarian societies. Likewise, this is true for empathy. We can counter it, as in the training of the military, to dehumanize our enemies, or we can encourage it by asking children to be more generous when they are hogging all the toys, or asking people to make charitable donations. DeWaal finishes his book where he began, with the discussion of the current scene in Western politics. He is not claiming or even thinking that we need to become some totally unselfish new kind of person. Furthermore, he thinks this is not even possible. Evolution builds on what has come before. Being competitive, having a certain amount of aggression has indeed great survival value. But cultivating empathy also has great survival value. It is actually showing enlightened self-interest. The whole growth of civilization is really the product of realizing that we are better off working together. Empathy binds individuals together and makes us all have a stake in society. DeWaal for many years was almost a lone voice in the evolutionary biology community advocating this view. But more and more people are changing their mind. I heard an interview with Dawkins a few months ago, and I was quite shocked and pleasantly surprised to see how much he had moved from his original writings. He acknowledges that unselfish behavior is much more widespread and occurs in a much wider range of conditions than what it originally evolved for. That is, it enjoys motivational autonomy. And this also brings up a concept in evolution that is important, and that is to make distinctions between ultimate and proximate causes. And DeWaal points this out very early in his book as well. Ultimate explanations explain why a particular trait evolved, but that may or may not give much insight into how a particular trait is being used today. or its proximate cause. And the classic example for this has been the evolution of altruism, the meerkat who acts as a sentinel and may lose his life in warning to others. How do we explain unselfish behavior? Dawkins and others wrote that even altruism is ultimately selfish. It's merely a way of getting one's genes into the next generation. When someone gives up her life to save a child, evolutionarily, the ultimate explanation is that this is a selfish act. But at the level of intentions and motivations, it is an unselfish act. And thus describing it as a genuine altruistic act is appropriate, even if its ultimate origins were in kin selection. But also, furthermore, people often do save non-kin and act unselfishly with no thought of reciprocity or reward. So I'm going to just end again because, with a little mention back to Huxley, because I think actually Huxley would be thrilled with these new findings. He was committed to empirical investigation, and he said we have to follow humbly wherever and to whatever abysses that nature leads. But I think this modern research is suggesting a way out of this dark side of human nature, and it's validating Huxley's earlier views that learning and abiding by nature's rules would result in a just and fair society. But of course, nature must be interpreted. Every human act results from a complex interaction of nature and culture. And I think in this regard, Huxley's fundamental message in evolutionary and ethics is not historically contingent. It's an elegant and compelling reminder that great caution must be exercised in evaluating any ethical system. But this is also why I personally find DeWaal's research so compelling, because I think he presents a very balanced point of view. He's not saying, oh, you know, nature is horrible, you know, humans are horrible, no, we're wonderful. Obviously, both animals and us we're a mixture of both. But I think he does really make a very compelling case that we can actually look to nature, and that this idea of showing us that now evolutionary ethics, it's showing us a way that we could actually make our ethics look to nature, look to biology, and that we might finally be able to now begin to break free of the problems that has sort of beset this point of view. Lynn?
I was curious about the story with the monkeys in the box and when they had the ghost box.
Yeah.
I was thinking, like, what does that mean, or is there a connection between how students are guided to learn online without having a teacher in person to teach and model some of the, and I was just thinking about that because I'm not sure.
Well, no, I think that's but you know, a teacher who is just giving content, I don't know if that would matter. I mean, you're reading in print, but that's an interesting question if you were really trying to teach something that really does involve physical movement. And certainly, I mean, you know, one of the things I teach now totally online and in the sciences, but I feel like most of the people, even like my upper division courses, I mean, they're not going to become science majors. And I feel like, you know, if you really want to be a card-carrying researcher or a nurse or something, I mean, you cannot do that just online. You have to have real physical training, absolutely. So
I might have to take that story to use it for the make a case. Not everything can be taught online.
yeah, no, I think so. And I mean, like Empire, I know actually does have, I think, a nursing degree and stuff. But I mean, they've paired up. I mean, you gotta go do some real hard clinical work, right? You can't just do it out of a book.
There must have been some sort of Newton or Alexander Graham Bell monkey at some point, because they do change in the wild. They do start using different tools. And I remember one situation in Japan where one started...
About the potato washing?
Yes,
right.
That sort of thing. So obviously somebody, one of them comes up with the original idea.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I mean, obviously they learn how to do all kinds of things, and the classic thing that's been also really well documented is about termite fishing. The mothers, you know, they take a long stick, and they stick it into termite mounds. And that is definitely, I mean, that was something that, you know, somebody figured out and is totally transmitted culturally, and the chimps have to learn. But this was a particular cognitive skill, right? I mean, this is the point. Chimps are not going to come across a box in the wild that way, right? So they had to be taught this particular skill, right?
I'll bet you there was one chimp who could do it eventually.
Well, I'm sure if you left the box out in the wild that was full of goodies, eventually, I mean, we certainly know, well, animals are smart. I mean, like, I'm a backpacker, and like the Yosemite bears are like, you know, now they're bear canisters, and the latest story I heard is that they are like throwing them off the cliff. We don't know if it's because they're just angry bears that they can't get in, or if this is actually a way of trying to crack open the, so yeah. Anyone who actually, I think I meant to bring it. There's another book which I actually wrote a review for. It's called Wild Justice by Mark Bekoff. And if you're interested in sort of animal stories and around this kind of issue, I recommend that book too. That's a new book too, just came out I think last year. It's called Wild Justice. Thank you.